June 26, 1943. It was supposed to be just another mission over France, a routine bomber escort run for the 56th Fighter Group, the kind of sortie that by mid-43 had become muscle memory for the pilots of the U.S. 8th Air Force. But for Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, that day would turn into something far beyond routine. It would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories in the entire air war, a day that would test not just the strength of his aircraft, but the limits of human endurance, faith, and luck. The morning began with the kind of nervous stillness pilots always felt before takeoff. Engines coughed, ground crews moved like ghosts beneath the wing, checking oil lines, fuel, ammunition. The air smelled of fuel and cold metal, familiar yet ominous. Johnson climbed into his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, his personal aircraft he'd named Half-Pint. It wasn't glamorous. The P-47 wasn't sleek like the Mustang or elegant like the Spitfire. It was big, heavy, and loud, a brute of an airplane, more engine than airframe. Pilots called it the Jug. At first, it was meant as an insult, a jab at its bulky shape, its milk-jug silhouette. But over time, the name became a badge of pride, because the Jug, ugly as it was, had one gift that mattered more than beauty. It brought you home. The 56th Fighter Group was already famous for its aggressive tactics. Commanded by Colonel Hubert Zemke, a man whose name carried weight across every airfield in England. The group had earned a reputation for innovation and fearlessness. Zemke taught his pilots to fight differently. He knew the Thunderbolt wasn't a nimble turn fighter. It was a powerhouse. So he trained them to fight in verticals, to dive, climb, and hit with devastating bursts from its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns. It was a strategy that favored brains over bravado, and that morning, Robert Johnson would put all of it, and more, to the test. The bombers they were escorting, Flying Fortresses B-17s, rumbled in tight formations thousands of feet above occupied France. The sun glinted off their wings, creating flashes of silver light that looked beautiful from afar, but meant danger up close. The Luftwaffe knew the routes, knew the patterns, and they were waiting. German radar had already picked up the formation. Somewhere below, engines were being started. Propellers spun. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, pulling on leather gloves, checking oxygen masks, readying for interception. The Thunderbolts roared into formation. Johnson's group took their position above and behind the bombers, the shield between the slow-moving fortresses and the German fighters that would soon rise to meet them. The radio crackled with brief, clipped voices, squadron leaders, giving vectors, altitude, enemy sightings. And then, out of the high haze, black specks began to appear. At first, it was just a few, then a dozen, then dozens. Focke-Wulf 190s, the Luftwaffe's deadly workhorse. Sleek, fast, and lethal, they came in waves, diving out of the sun, guns blazing. The sky turned into chaos tracer fire, black puffs of flak, streaking contrails, fragments of aluminum. Pilots shouted into radios, pulling hard on control sticks, breaking formation, rolling, diving. Johnson stayed with his flight leader as long as he could, firing short bursts, watching flashes of light dance across a 190's fuselage before it peeled away, trailing smoke. Then, in a blink, his world changed. A burst of 20mm cannon shells tore into his Thunderbolt. The cockpit shook violently. The smell of burning fuel filled his lungs. His canopy was shattered, his control cables cut, his rudder jammed. The aircraft began to spin, dropping fast. Johnson tried to pull up. Nothing. The stick was stiff as concrete. His hand slipped on the blood from a wound in his arm. He fought the controls, shouted into his radio, but his transmitter was dead. The Thunderbolt was dying, and it was taking him with it. Flames licked across the instrument panel. A hole the size of a fist opened in the floor beneath his seat. The roar of the wind filled his ears as the aircraft plummeted toward the French countryside. He tried to bail out, but the canopy frame was twisted and jammed. He couldn't move it. The nose dipped steeper. The altimeter spun. The engine screamed. He thought of home, of Oklahoma, of his family, of the quiet streets where he'd learned to drive and dreamt of flying. This was it, he thought. This was how it ends. But then something impossible happened. The fire died out. The spin stopped. The engine coughed and kept running. His Thunderbolt, torn apart by cannon fire, somehow refused to die. He regained a little control, just enough to level out. He couldn't turn much, couldn't climb, but he could fly, barely. The instrument panel was shattered, his canopy gone, the wind whipping into his face. He was bleeding, half blind, half deaf, but alive. He pointed the nose west and prayed. England was hundreds of miles away, across hostile territory, and he was flying alone, low, slow, and vulnerable. Minutes later, another shape appeared behind him, a Focke-Wulf 190. It had followed him down. The German pilot could have finished him off easily, but he didn't. He pulled alongside, flying wing to wing. Johnson could see the man's face behind the glass, young, calm, almost respectful. For a moment, the two men locked eyes across the gulf of war. Then the German rocked his wings and flew away. Johnson didn't understand why. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe the German assumed no man could make it home in that wreck. Maybe it was respect, one pilot to another. Whatever it was, that gesture, that silent salute, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Johnson limped his crippled Thunderbolt back across the channel, every minute a battle against gravity and pain. Ground crews stared in disbelief as the battered P-47 came into view. Riddled with holes, its skin shredded, one wing nearly torn apart. It crash-landed at an airfield in England, skidding across the grass before coming to a halt. When the crews reached him, they found the aircraft had taken more than 200 bullet holes and 21 cannon hits. Yet it had flown, it had survived, and so had Robert Johnson. That day became legend, the impossible flight, the indestructible jug. And from that moment on, no one in the 56th Fighter Group ever doubted the Thunderbolt again. As the battered Thunderbolt sat on the English airfield, ground crews gathered around in stunned silence. The skin of the aircraft was shredded, jagged holes through the fuselage, metal peeled back like paper. Fuel leaked from punctured lines, oil streaked the underside black. The propeller was nicked and scarred, the control surfaces half destroyed, yet somehow, impossibly, the aircraft had brought its pilot home. Robert Johnson was pulled from the cockpit, pale and bleeding but alive. Medics rushed him away as the rest of his squadron arrived, their eyes wide in disbelief. Men who had flown dozens of missions, who had seen aircraft disintegrate under far less damage, stood around that wrecked Thunderbolt as if it were something supernatural. One of the mechanics ran a hand over the bullet holes and whispered, "How in God's name did this thing stay in the air?" Word spread fast. Within hours, the story had reached other groups on nearby bases. By nightfall, the name Half-Pint was already legend. Men gathered in mess halls, retelling the story in whispers. Johnson took 21 cannon hits and 200 bullets, they said, and came back. It didn't sound real, but the photos taken that day proved it. The punctures, the shattered plexiglass, the mangled wings, all of it was there, frozen on film. For pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, it was more than a story of survival. It was a revelation. Until that day, many of them had viewed the P-47 with suspicion. They'd complained it was too heavy, too sluggish, too slow to climb compared to the German fighters. They envied the Spitfires and later the Mustangs, aircraft that seemed made for the romantic image of dogfighting, fast, sleek, elegant. The Thunderbolt was none of those things. It was brute strength over beauty. But after June 26th, the pilots of the 56th stopped seeing it as just a machine. They began to see it as something else entirely, a guardian, a fortress with wings. The aircraft's enormous Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a massive, air-cooled radial, had saved Johnson's life. Unlike liquid-cooled engines in other fighters, it could take hits without leaking away its lifeblood. The thick armor plating around the cockpit and fuel tanks, the rugged construction of its wings and fuselage, all designed to absorb punishment, had done exactly that. The P-47 wasn't built to dance, it was built to endure, and that day it proved its worth beyond argument. When Johnson recovered enough to walk, he visited his aircraft again. The ground crew had patched the holes, counted the scars, documented everything. He stood beside it quietly, one hand resting on the metal skin. For a long time he said nothing, then he smiled, a tired small smile, and said, "That old Jug. She brought me home." From that day on, the word Jug wasn't a joke anymore. It became a name said with affection, with pride. Pilots painted it on their planes. They talked about it like it was a partner, not just a piece of equipment. "Trust the Jug," they'd say before missions. "She'll get you back." As the months went on, the legend of the P-47 grew. The 56th Fighter Group, known as Zemke's Wolfpack after their hard-driving commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, became one of the most feared and respected units in the air war. Zemke himself was a man obsessed with tactical precision. He knew the Thunderbolt wasn't made for tight turns or quick dogfights, but it could dive like nothing else in the sky. He taught his men to use that power instead of trying to match the nimble German fighters in horizontal turns. They fought in vertical space, diving from altitude, striking fast, and climbing away before the enemy could react. It was brutal, efficient, and devastating. The P-47 could reach speeds of over 500 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any German aircraft could safely follow. Zemke drilled his men to fight as a team, to use altitude and energy instead of agility. And it worked. The Luftwaffe began to learn that tangling with Thunderbolts was a losing proposition. Johnson, once a fresh pilot barely out of training, was now a veteran. Calm, analytical, confident, he flew more than 90 combat missions between April 1943 and May 1944, racking up 27 confirmed kills. Every time he took off, he carried the memory of that June morning with him. He knew the Jug could survive what others could not. Across England, the myth of the P-47 spread. It was said that if you wanted to get into a dogfight, fly a Spitfire, but if you wanted to come home, fly a Thunderbolt. By late 1943, the statistics began to tell their own story. The P-47's combat loss rate per mission was among the lowest of any American fighter, just 0.7%. Its kill-to-loss ratio in aerial combat was 4.6 to 1, better than the more glamorous P-51 Mustang. Pilots who had once doubted it now swore by it. It was a plane that demanded respect, not because it was the most agile, or the prettiest, or the fastest, but because it was unstoppable. It was a machine built not for glory, but for survival. And in war, survival was everything. As 1944 dawned, the Thunderbolt's role began to evolve. The arrival of the Mustang, with its long range, meant that the P-47s would take on new duties. Low-level ground attack. It was a dangerous job. Flying at treetop height meant facing every machine gun, every flak battery, every rifle on the ground. But the Thunderbolt's toughness made it perfect for the role. While the Mustangs guarded the bombers high above, the Jugs thundered low over Europe, tearing apart rail lines, convoys, and bridges. They carried bombs, rockets, and thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They destroyed trains, trucks, tanks, and anything else that moved. The Germans came to fear the sound of those engines. A deep, droning growl that signaled destruction was coming. To them, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a predator. In 11 months, from D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolts destroyed or damaged more than 68,000 trucks, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored vehicles. They crippled German logistics, choking supply lines and isolating frontline troops. The Luftwaffe could still fight, but their armies could no longer move. The Jabos, as the Germans called them, short for Jagdbomber, had made daylight movement nearly impossible. Every pilot who flew those missions knew the risk. Flak guns waited in every valley, every village, but time and again the Thunderbolts came back. Sometimes riddled with holes, sometimes limping on one engine cylinder, but still flying. The legend of the Jug grew not from propaganda, but from hard reality, from the thousands of men who flew them, fought in them, and came home in them. They didn't need fame. They didn't need to be the prettiest plane in the sky. The P-47's beauty was in its strength. Robert Johnson lived to tell the tale, one of the lucky ones who could say he'd seen death up close and flown straight through it. Years later, when asked about that day over France, he didn't talk about fear or glory. He talked about the airplane. The Jug, he said, wasn't just a fighter. It was a friend. It got me home. After the war ended, the skies over Europe fell silent, but the legend of the Thunderbolt didn't fade. For the men who had flown it, the Jug wasn't just another aircraft. It was a symbol of survival, of brute strength in a world consumed by chaos. It had carried them across the Channel, through flak bursts and tracer fire, into battles they weren't sure they'd return from. And almost every time, it had brought them back. Robert Johnson returned home in June 1944. He was 23 years old, but carried the weight of a lifetime of combat on his shoulders. For his courage, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, air medals, and a Purple Heart for his wounds. When he stepped off the train in Oklahoma, there were no parades waiting, no cameras flashing. He quietly married his high school sweetheart, Barbara, and started a family. He had 4 children and spent a few years as a flight instructor before leaving aviation altogether. For the rest of his life, he worked in insurance, living quietly, modestly, and without seeking fame. But those who knew him said he never forgot June 26, 1943, the day his P-47 took 21 cannon hits and 200 machine gun strikes and still flew home. He often said, "That was the day I should have died." For years, Johnson believed that the German pilot who attacked him was Lieutenant Colonel Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces. The story became part of the legend, retold in books and documentaries. Some even claimed Johnson later contacted Mayer's family to express his respect. But later research told a different story. German records showed no combat claim from Mayer that day. In fact, Mayer wasn't even flying with that unit. He was between commands. The attack came from another group entirely, Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the Luftwaffe's fiercest fighter wings. To this day, no one knows for certain who that German pilot was, the one who, after tearing Johnson's aircraft apart, chose not to finish him off, but instead rocked his wings in a salute before flying away. The man who showed that small moment of humanity in the middle of war remains nameless. But maybe his name doesn't matter. What mattered was what that fight proved, that the P-47 Thunderbolt was nearly indestructible. That wasn't a myth. That wasn't wartime propaganda. It was cold, undeniable fact. Even the Luftwaffe's aces began to respect the Thunderbolt. They'd seen what it could do, how it could dive faster than anything else in the sky. At full throttle, it could hit speeds of 500 miles per hour, tearing through the clouds like a falling anvil. No Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could safely follow it down. And it wasn't just the plane's power, it was the men behind it. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, became legendary. They produced 17 aces, 3 double aces, and some of the top American fighter pilots of the war. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski scored 28 kills, Robert Johnson, 27, David Schilling, 22 and a half. All of them flew Thunderbolts. They didn't become legends because of luck. They did it because they trusted their aircraft, because they learned to use it not like a sports car, but like a hammer. They fought with aggression, precision, and power. By the end of the war, the P-47 had flown more than 746,000 combat sorties, more than any other American fighter. It destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft and tens of thousands of ground targets. Its combat loss rate was among the lowest of any fighter in World War II. It was a machine that could take hell and keep flying. The German pilots feared the Thunderbolt's presence over the battlefield. They gave it a nickname, Jabo, short for Jag Bomber or Fighter Bomber. When Jabos appeared in the sky, German troops knew to dive for cover. The roar of those radial engines meant destruction was seconds away. The P-47s would come roaring in low, guns blazing. Their 8.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 13 rounds per second, would tear through trucks, tanks, and troop columns. And then came the rockets and bombs, raining fire across the countryside. Between D-Day in June 1944 and VE Day in May 1945, the Thunderbolts turned German logistics into chaos. Daytime movement became suicide. Trains were blown apart before they could deliver supplies. Convoys burned on the roads. Fuel depots vanished in fireballs. The German army, once a machine of relentless precision, began to starve, sputter, and break. It wasn't glamorous work. Ground attack was dirty, low, and deadly. Pilots flew through a storm of flak and small arms fire on every mission. Many didn't come back. But for every Thunderbolt that went down, dozens of German targets were destroyed, and through all of it, the Jug kept proving its worth. Pilots returned to base in aircraft that should have been scrap metal, wings shredded, engines smoking, holes you could fit your arm through. Yet somehow the Jug kept flying. It wasn't just a machine of war, it was a symbol of resilience. Years later, when Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the Wolfpack, spoke about the P-47, he said something that captured its spirit perfectly. The P-47 wasn't underrated because people didn't know it. It was underrated because they didn't understand it. They called it heavy, clumsy, even ugly. But what they didn't see was the genius of its design. It wasn't built to outturn or outdance its enemy. It was built to outlast them. It could dive faster, hit harder, and survive longer than anything the Germans could build. In the right hands, it was unstoppable. That philosophy, power over elegance, strength over speed, would echo far beyond World War II. After the war, Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet, one of America's first jet fighters. It inherited the Jug's DNA, rugged, heavily armed, and built to bring its pilot home. That same philosophy carried into the F-105 Thunderchief in the 1960s, another Republic aircraft known for its toughness in Vietnam. You can even see the Thunderbolt's legacy in modern aircraft like the A-10 Warthog, a plane built around its gun, designed to take hits and keep flying. Just like its ancestor, the P-47's influence wasn't just in design, it was in mindset. It taught an entire generation of pilots and engineers that agility isn't everything, that survivability is just as vital. Because war isn't about who flies the prettiest aircraft, it's about who makes it home. Robert Johnson lived a full life after the war. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary listed his decorations, his 27 kills, his Distinguished Service Cross. But it didn't mention June 26, 1943, the day his aircraft took over 200 hits and refused to die. Maybe that's fitting. Johnson didn't seek fame. He didn't need it. The Jug had already written his story for him. Today, at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a P-47 Thunderbolt stands proudly on display. Its olive green paint gleams under the hangar lights, its broad wings stretching like a silent guardian of the past. Visitors stop, read the placard, and learn that over 15,000 Thunderbolts were built, one of the most produced American fighters of the war. But what that sign doesn't capture is the feeling, the faith pilots had in the Jug, the stories etched into its aluminum skin, because the P-47 wasn't famous for being beautiful. It was famous for being faithful. It wasn't the plane that won the headlines. It was the plane that brought its pilots home. It taught a simple but powerful lesson. War isn't won by perfection. It's won by perseverance. If you found this story powerful, don't let it fade into history. Hit that like button to help others discover these forgotten tales of World War II. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the machines and men who shaped the skies. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from? Our community spans the world, from Texas to Tokyo, from veterans to history lovers. Together, we keep these stories alive. Because every pilot, every aircraft, and every story like the Thunderbolts deserves to be remembered. The war eventually ended. The guns fell silent. But the legend of the Thunderbolt never did. It stood as a reminder that survival itself is victory. That courage, steel, and sheer will can turn the tide when everything seems lost. Men like Robert Johnson, Francis Gabreski, and the Wolfpack didn't just fight. They defined what it meant to endure. Their stories weren't of glamour, but of grit, of roaring engines, torn wings, and the will to bring a crippled aircraft home against impossible odds. The P-47 wasn't built to be beautiful. It was built to be unstoppable, and in that purpose, it became immortal. Today, when you see a Thunderbolt gleaming under museum lights, think of the men who once strapped themselves into that armor of steel, who faced down enemy fire not with hope of glory, but with the desperate belief that the Jug might just take one more hit and still bring them home, because that's what the Thunderbolt symbolized. Not just power, but protection. Not just war, but survival. It wasn't just a machine of metal and fire. It was a promise, forged in the skies over Europe, that even in the darkest moments of war, there's something stronger than fear. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into the static of history. Hit like to help others rediscover the machines and men who shaped our world. Subscribe for more untold stories from the battlefields, skies, and seas of World War II. And tell us in the comments, if you could sit in the cockpit of one World War II aircraft, which would you choose? Because remembering them keeps them alive. And as long as these stories are told, the Thunderbolt still flies.